Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in Matthew chapter 9, and we're going to, I did notice here, I don't know if I'm going to get to the last part of this about the harvest. We'll see. um, but what we will be covering, um, one, Jesus doing a lot of healings that people, by their faith, see, draw out of him. In other words, they receive these healings by their faith. Now, these healings also, they are proofs, you could say. They are proofs that he is the Messiah, their Messiah. And so the faith is centralized, okay? That and everyone that was encountering Jesus, when they said they had faith, and I'll make this quick deduction about faith. Sometimes, if you see people, they might say that the way they picture faith is sort of a blind trust, okay? In other words, a blind trust. Something you create in your mind, and then you say, "I just believe it." That's not biblical faith. And biblical faith was never just, "Well, just trust me." We are seeing throughout the gospel here that everyone's faith was always based on, you could say, evidence that was displayed or shown. So that a lack of faith would be, here you see the evidence, but you're not believing in the evidence. So when you think about Israel, when it came time for them to cross over into to the promised land, and this is about in their second year. In their second year, they could have went into the promised land. Instead, they spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness because of their unbelief. And the reason why is because when God said, "Hey, go over into actually God said, I think the initial thing with God was send two of the elders over into the land, spy out the land. The purpose with that was to sort of map it out. For some reason, they said, no, let's send 12. And that ended up being a disaster. The 12 came back, all except two, Joshua and Caleb. But the other 10 came back and poisoned the people. Oh, we can't take the land. If we go to the land, we're going to die. It was a death sentence, a 40-year death sentence for that first generation. God says, because you don't believe. Now keep this in mind. Why wouldn't they believe? In front of their eyes, God crippled the mightiest nation, Egypt, broke the bondage of their slavery. Why wouldn't they believe? And then brought them through the Red Sea. Why wouldn't they believe? Continually fed them. Why wouldn't they believe? So, let's bring up the screen here. So, Matthew chapter 9, and let's go back. Chapter 9, verse 18. So he says, as he was telling them these things, suddenly one of the leaders came and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter is near death, but come lay your hand on her, and she will live." So Jesus and his disciples got up and followed him. Now, if you remember, let's see here. Oh, we talked about fasting. Well, no, not so much as fasting, but the religious aspect, how in just a year they had already made John the Baptist a religion. That's not to be confused with the Baptist religion. Um, their thing was a Baptist religion, and they was also trying to follow the Pharisees. So that's why I said, as he was telling them these things, suddenly one of the leaders came and knelt down before him, saying, "My daughter is near death, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." So Jesus got up, and so Jesus and his disciples got up and followed him. Now, this story is given by Mark, and I think by Luke. So I'm just going to respond to how Matthew is presenting the story here. Okay. But notice he said one of the leaders. Now, you should also know that the reason why that note is important is because the Pharisees had, because of their hatred for Jesus, they had put out an edict that anyone who was following Jesus would be ostracized. And just think about that for a moment. Anyone following Jesus would be ostracized. They didn't care that his daughter was gravely ill. Just don't follow Jesus. So as they were following, verse 20, just then a woman who had suffered from bleeding for 12 years approached from behind and touched the tassel of his robe. Now, again, you see two examples of faith. So this guy is risking, the leader risking his status for his daughter's sake. So you can see this is real faith here. And then here comes a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, approached him and touched his tassel. But she said to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I'll be made well. Now, so where was her faith centered in? Jesus. The fact that he could do it, they've seen Jesus do it, so both in respect. And not only that, but not only did they see that Jesus could do it, but they also see that Jesus was willing to do it. Verse 22, but Jesus turned and saw her. Have courage, daughter, he said, your faith has made you well. And the woman was made well from that moment. So that when Jesus came to the leader's house, now, again, I'll deal with, there is a greater description of this scene as it plays out here. And I'll defer it to when we get to, I believe it's in Mark and certainly in Luke. Luke, being a physician, gives more medical kind of assessment of the woman. And then Mark, I think, gives the kind of assessment of the urgency of it. Here, this woman comes and kind of interrupts. Now, he already told Jesus she's near death. And as they were as they were making their way to the house, this woman interrupts this. I can imagine this guy sitting there looking at his watch saying, okay, yeah, I'm happy for you, right? But Jesus, we got to keep moving here, right? And when Jesus, verse 23, when Jesus came to the leader's house, he saw the flute players and the crowd lamenting loudly, meaning she had already died. So he said, leave, he said, because the girl is dead, but sleeping. So now you see that Jesus always referred to the person that's dead as sleeping. That's kind of interesting there. And so anyway, as they started laughing at him, but when the crowd had been put aside, he went in, took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And this news spread throughout the whole area, right? So these healings, right, spread. And so now everybody knows. By the way, this crowd is ignoring what the Pharisees' edict were. Okay? Verse 27. As Jesus went on from there, two blind men followed him, shouting, have mercy on us, son of David. Now this is interesting because this is a messianic term. Have mercy on us, son of David. When he entered the house, the blind men approached him, and Jesus said to him, do you believe that I can do this? Yes, Lord, they answered him. Got an interesting question, right? The blind people that came. I get the picture how they fumbled into the house. I'm not saying that that's how they did it. That's just a picture in my mind. Verse 29, then he touched their eyes, saying, let it be done for you according to your faith. And their eyes were open, and Jesus warned them sternly, be sure that no one finds out. But they went out and spread the news about him throughout the whole area. Now again, why does Jesus tell them we don't want anybody to find out? Now there are several different reasons, because obviously if they're blind, right, and now they're walking around looking, people are going to know. So the idea was Jesus wasn't trying to keep their healing secret, but in so many cases, as it were, like now when they went out and spread the news, people thronged the house. So maybe he was trying to rest, and then he couldn't. Maybe he just he wanted to. Maybe he had a specific purpose, and so the crowds would kind of spoil that. Verse 32, just as they were going out, a demon-possessed man who was unable to speak was brought to him. When the demon had been driven out, the man spoke, and the crowds were amazed, saying, nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel. He said, but the Pharisees said he drives out demons by the rulers of demons. Now, again, when we talk about demon possession, this is not mental illness. This is not, schizophrenia or anything like that. These are either actual spirits. You can say disembodied spirits. We don't really know the origins, by the way, when you get the word demons. But there certainly are disembodied spirits, and they are certainly evil spirits. That when they possess people, it is a torment. They disrupt their lives. The person cannot function normally. He is controlled. That's why the idea of possession, he is controlled. Now, as I said before about the two demons that entered the demons that entered the 2,000 pigs that Jesus cast out, how would that look for us today? In other words, is demon possession still happening today? The answer is, of course it is. But one of the things about our society is that we're good at hiding. We don't like to see all of the ugly. So so especially like in our culture, we were institutionalized. So for example, if there was a demon-possessed person, right, we would secure them and then put them in an institution. And we do have those different levels of institutions, anywhere from, the mild side, light, the, not talking about like demon possession. In other words, we would never call it demon possession. And by the way, this is not to be confused with mental illness. I'm saying that demon possession is something totally different than mental illness. See, mental illness is that something with your brain is, let me make this case. The mental disability. There's things wrong physically with your brain and emotions, okay? Mental illness is something more about the mind, okay? The mind. And so it doesn't function normally. Now, for example, they used to say the word being retardation. They don't use that word, but just, because that's just, again, how, to me, our society is. You can find old blueprints of some of the older institution buildings, and they're going to tell you it'll say retarded center. So just because we change the name doesn't mean that the conditions are better or different. It's the same condition. But my point is that those are, we're talking about, a person that is born with a mental disability. It could be anywhere from mild or high level to severe. Okay. And again, those are not demon possessions. Demon possession is a spirit. And here's the interesting thing, that whenever Jesus cast a demon out, that person was instantly normal. In other words, the cause of it was the demon itself, not a mental disability. Now, of course, Jesus also could heal a person that had a mental defect. But in this case here, these were demon possessions. All right, verse 35 says, Then Jesus went to all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every sicknesses. Now so he's making the circuit. The synagogues, a synagogue, especially back then, was, you could say, it was a little small, not temple, and they did not perform the temple services and practices like animal sacrifices, things like that. The purpose were, they pretty much would you would have a synagogue leader, and they would meet and usually have what we would call like a church service, singing. They would read. There was reading of the Old Testament, and then and that was it basically. Okay. So when you think about places that were far away, now you have to remember the actual temple was in Jerusalem. So, for example, when Jesus lived way up north, Jerusalem was south. So Jesus lived in Capernaum, and he grew up in Nazareth, that they had temples. So you wouldn't go to you wouldn't make the trip to go to the you wouldn't go to the temple in Jerusalem every day or every week. Now they did make the trip 3 times a year for the festivals. So he says, and when he saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them because they were weary and worn out, like sheep without a shepherd. Here is the sad thing about the spiritual condition of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, pretty much almost any time, is when you have this condition where the sheep are not being fed. And then he said to his disciples, the harvest is abundant, but the workers are few. Therefore pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers in his harvest. This is one of the prime, you can say the prime directive. This is why we're here. To be sent into God's harvest, to reach the harvest. And even if you think about it now, we're going to get into this in the next chapter, where notice he said Jesus went to the towns. Now keep this in mind, when Jesus was here, Jesus, God manifested in the flesh, however, limited to the flesh. Okay? Limited to the flesh. So when you saw, what you see here is the human Jesus, the man Jesus, the Son of Man, human Jesus. He was limited to space and time. And so he would go from city to city, circuit to circuit, right? I mean, city to city, synagogue to synagogue. Okay. So what God's now purpose as you're going to see, what his purpose is he's going to train the apostles. And when the apostles, they're going to be sent out. And then when they go out, they're going to what? Teach and train others. So when he says the harvest is abundant, but the workers are few, and now he says, pray to the Lord of harvest to send out workers, okay, to workers into his harvest. So in some kind of way, if you're not working in the harvest of God, you're not really doing what God wants. I'm not talking, and again, I'm not saying that everybody has to be evangelists, missionaries, things like that. Because again, you could be working in God's harvest. So when you think about Jesus as he is here, guess where Jesus wasn't, right? He wasn't in Rome. He wasn't in Africa. He wasn't in Egypt, right? So the idea was to multiply workers, multiply believers, and then ultimately workers. All right. So we will pick up in chapter 10 in the next study, because we will get more into this when Jesus is going to actually send out the apostles. And the idea, you can almost say it's kind of a training thing, but ultimately the maturity of a church, okay? And this is the sad part, because today churches are kind of like social gatherings, concerts, and they all but dance. I mean, in some cases they are dancing, okay, but they're not being trained. They're not being taught. They're not being prepared to work in God's harvest. But one of the saddest things is when Jehovah Witnesses. Now you see a lot of Black Hebrew Israelites and groups like them that confront Christians and just utterly shame them because of the ignorance of the Christians, the biblical illiteracy of Christians. And that should be. The one thing the church should be doing is preparing people for the harvest, equipping them. And the very first thing is you have to know the Bible, you have to know God's Word. All right, guys, we'll pick this up next time. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to the Bible Plain and Simple. And if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. I'll see you next time.